Hello and welcome to the fifth episode of Nations of Charlemagne. Today we are going to be discussing the formation of the Holy Roman Empire itself. As always, we are joined by Columba. Hello.
Hello, guys.
And Marcus Furious Pertinax.
Good evening, everyone.
Wonderful to have you both on again. Just like to give a little introduction for this night's discussion, we're going to be dividing the early history of the Holy Roman Empire in two streams. Because it covers so much of European history at once. So this stream is going to be focusing more on the Kingdom of Germany and the inception of German nationality, German language, and politics as directed from the German kings. And next week's discussion, it's going to be a discussion about the Holy Roman Empire, in particular the Hohenstaufens, which is the third great imperial dynasty. However, it's also going to, cross over with the Emirate of Sicily, the Normans, the Venetians, etc. So we're going to be very brief when summarizing details going on in Italy during this period, but we will refer to Italy when it is pertinent, and especially with the Papal States, because it's involved in the investiture controversy. I think one of the interesting things to note is that the Holy Roman Empire is always sort of derided as being neither holy nor Roman, nor really an empire. But I think, as we'll demonstrate with its foundation under Otto, and yes, I'm very much one of the historians who does believe that Otto is the first Holy Roman Emperor, not Charlemagne, if nothing else, due to the distinct nature of the empire under the Attonians as opposed to the Carolingians. One withers away very quickly. The Ottonian Dynasty, however, and the empire it establishes is able to last all the way up until 1806. The Holy Roman Empire.
At least to my sort of limited understanding on the area, the Ottonians thoroughly established the Germanness of the Holy Roman Empire, which to me seems like a sort of essential part of it.
Yes, as opposed to the Frankish Carolingian dynasty.
Yes.
So yes, there are many very important distinctions. That in the sense also that France was never part of the Holy Roman Empire, as we talked about in the Carolingian Empire. West Francia breaks off and it has its own independent history from here on in. However, Burgundy, Italy, and Germany are going to have a entwined history, all the way up until the early modern period. So yes, I think in terms of starting at the Ottonians, it makes sense. And I think, as we'll discuss, it was a Holy Roman Empire in the sense that periodically the emperors based themselves in Rome. They were, completely supreme over at least the north of Italy. They were holy in the sense that the emperors exercised a form of basically a patronage relationship with the church, in the sense that the church was there to support the imperial administration and was, almost inseparable from it. And it's one of the reasons why the investiture controversy damages the empire so much.
And also, if we look at the empire striking out east and the Crusades and the Christianization, it does have a sort of everything that it does, the martial aspect of the empire seems to be sort of at least politically, at least on the surface, but I assume on a deeper level, in the beliefs of the men themselves, it's serving this higher goal as well.
Yes, it is politically and militarily dominant from the 10th century up until the 13th century, when you can argue that the Holy Christian Kingdom sort of reorganizes around France. So without further ado, we'll start off with the nitty-gritty of this discussion, which is to give everyone a little overview on how the Carolingian Empire dissolved and, what was the empire that replaced it. So as we sort of ended our last discussion, I believe it was 843 in the Treaty of Verdun, we see the division of the empire after Louis the Pious into these three domains. And as you can see in the second map here, the middle domain, or Middle Francia, very quickly breaks up into Lotharingia, Burgundy, and the Kingdom of Italy.
And this is even though the sort of central division, the central third of the empire was meant to be the dominant one, right? At least de jure.
Yes, Louis the Pious left his eldest son, Lothar, hence Lotharingia, hence Lorraine, to his eldest son. And of course, the capital was in Aachen, which was, the capital of Austrasia, was the capital of Charlemagne, which is, in modern day West Germany. All of these centers of imperial power, but also, the controlling influence of the Pope was vested in Middle Francia. However, due to the very complex geography and due to sort of no overarching, cultural connections between these regions other than administration in Latin, it was very easy to pick apart in the constant civil wars that were going on. So Lothar dies in 855, and the empire is, as you can see, divided again under his various sons. So Lothair II takes over the area of Lorraine, which is going to be broken up again. And this is like the origins of the Benelux countries, the Low Countries you can see here. Louis II becomes King of Burgundy, and Charles becomes, Louis II becomes King of Italy, and Charles becomes King of Burgundy. And to make this more complicated, the imperial position is inherited by Louis II, but it becomes less and less and less. It essentially becomes, the first among equals in terms of all the kings who are basically becoming, more and more independent. So Louis II inherits Burgundy, so only making up part of the old realm of Middle Francia. And then with the death of Lothair II, as you can see in the fourth map, that area is partitioned as well, even though that'll only last for a short amount of time and briefly be restored. There's a moment when the king of West Francia, Charles the Bald, briefly becomes emperor. And the last moment where you have the unification of the empire is, you can almost say it's completely inadvertent, because Charles III, known to posterity as Charles the Fat, just so happens to be very fortunate in the fact that as king of East Francia, he inherits Italy, he inherits Burgundy, and he inherits West Francia, but does virtually nothing with it. In fact, despite controlling all three elements of the empire, he is defeated by the Vikings. This is when the Vikings row up the Seine, attack the city of Paris, and the emperor pays them off rather than defeating them. So
they're also attacking all over the east coast of England and Britain generally, right? They're striking out in a lot of places at this time.
They're striking out all over the world. They're attacking the Mediterranean. They're attacking the Byzantine Empire.
They're off to Canada.
Russia.
They're off to Baghdad.
They're off to found Vinland. Yeah.
Just on that note, just for a little tidbit for the audience, I actually can't remember who made this reference, but at this point in time, the Scandinavian countries, or that part of the world, is referred to as the wombs of people, because these attacks were so unrelenting. They just assumed that Scandinavia was just this confluence of Vikings that never ended.
I could see it could seem that way. Yes.
Yeah.
It's quite odd looking at the geography, but nevertheless, it's quite an interesting interpretation.
Indeed, it's rather ironic, isn't it? But nonetheless.
And I've also heard, and I know we don't want to go too much into Italy, but when we're looking at, you mentioned that the imperial title becomes this sort of, just this sort of ball that's thrown around, this honorable title that's sort of bought and sold in a sense. And I've heard, I've watched a couple of other podcasts before this, and I've been reading some stuff, and this seems to be a big part, in large part, the families who control the papacy at this period, exerting their influence and their power. Would you say that's a sort of a fair characterization?
With Italy especially, Italy is basically bedlam at this point. As we're going to
the Kingdom of Italy, yeah, definitely.
Yes, the Kingdom of Italy is basically bedlam. And we'll talk about the papal states politics at the end when we talk about the investiture controversy. But in terms of Italy, Italy is the most unstable of all these regions.
And so remains so for a very long time.
And remains so for a very long time.
It still remains so.
Quite.
So it's going to be constant wars, which are going on during this period. And as we see, well, first of all, Charles III, in terms of to try and understand his failure, I mean, he was emperor of the United Empire only for 3 years. And during that time, as I said, he suffered all of these military defeats. And this is, attributed to the fact, obviously, his weight, hence the name lethargy, but also the fact that he probably suffered from epilepsy. So within 3 years, on the back of this, he is deposed by his nephew, the illegitimate son of his brother, Carloman of Bavaria. And here we have probably one of the last noteworthy Carolingian kings, Arnulf of Carinthia, because he is, unlike his uncle, he's a very successful military king. He defeats the Vikings at Leuven in 891 and, goes against war with the Slavs in Pannonia, modern-day Hungary, and briefly unites Italy with East Germany, which is his realm. East Germany, of course. East Francia. Sorry, I'm going to get that mixed up probably a lot of times during this discussion, but bear with me.
It's all right. It's all right. It's more than all right.
And he briefly, as I mentioned, holds the position of emperor, even though this becomes more diminutive with every passing generation, and has suzerainty over the king of West Francia, Otto. But he dies very soon after achieving this feat. and he's replaced by his 6-year-old son, who becomes, obviously a very wonderful naming convention with the Carolingian kings. Louis the Child, very appropriately, becomes king at the age of 6.
That's great. That's fantastic.
So, and yes, Louis the Child is the last Carolingian king proper of the Carolingian dynasty. I mean, in terms of like a legitimate succession, the last king is really Charles III, Charles the Fat, because Arnulf, of course, was illegitimate. But nevertheless, the last king to sort of bear the Carolingian line was Louis the Child. And due to, obviously his minority, most of the military operations during his realm are taken over by his various lords, and they are repeatedly defeated by the Magyars, who we'll get onto eventually. And I believe the king is defeated at the First Battle of Lechfeld in 910. He's defeated at Augsburg. He's defeated at Ensburg, and he dies a year later, leaving, at 18, ironically, upon assuming his majority. And there is a massive power vacuum in East Francia. However, there is quite an interesting development, which we'll go into now discussing, which is the origin of Germany as a distinct entity. So from East Francia to Germany, so I can stop getting those titles muddled. The consequence of the creation of basically Charlemagne's conquest of the Saxons meant that all of the German-speaking polities were actually under the rule of one king. So ironically, Charlemagne, the foreign conqueror, even though, again, the Franks have been, assimilated into this Gallo-Romance culture in the West, in Neustria in particular. I mean, we didn't really discuss the languages of the Franks in terms of their linguistic development. Obviously, the clergy and the administration spoke Latin, and the laws were promulgated in Latin. But of course, in Italy, we have the Lombards and the Roman population existing as like a dual structure. And eventually, the Lombards will become assimilated into Vulgar Latin, which is the language spoken in Italy at this time. In West Francia, as we know, Gallo-Romance, the Gallic fusion with the Latin language begins to build, what will eventually become the Langue d'Oil, which will happen slightly later after this period. But in terms of like how this affected Germany, as you can see on this map, we have all these tribes. They had no history of unity. I mean, as we saw, probably the closest figure in Romantic German history who united the German peoples was Hermann. Also known as Arminius, which didn't last very long. So yes, Germany
only in the direst circumstances, yeah.
And only in the direst circumstances when it looked like the Romans were going to be expanding up to the River Elbe. And so weirdly, again, we're in a situation where it's the Franks who impose unity of the Germans, and this creation of a polity known as East Francia as distinct from West Francia and Italy actually creates sort of the basis of modern Germany and what would be called throughout the medieval ages the Kingdom of Germany. As you can see on this map, the Franks had conquered various tribes, and prior during the Merovingian dynasty they had been various sort of suzerain duchies, under sort of Merovingian dominance. And during the Frankish conquest, they had been, created as counties and duchies. The duchies were based along these tribal links. So there was a great amount of sort of ethnic and linguistic solidarity within these regions, and a great lot of historical unity as well. And this is where we have a lot of sort of German historians trying to identify, how to refer to these regions. And the modern distinction is to refer to them as Stamm, which means tribe in German, and to distinguish this idea of a stem duchy or a younger duchy as this continuity of these traditional sort of tribal modes of association, which then develop into these duchies, which will dominate the early medieval German history.
Yeah, so, I mean, you have like Saxony and Frisia, and these are all the sort of the classic tribes that you even read about in the ancient sources. So yeah, it's built off of these tribes. I mean, we do see that the importance of older tribes in West Francia as well. With the Parisi, and then you get Paris later on, but it is different in the sense that here they are I'd say incorporated within the sort of legal and administrative system in a more extensive way.
Yes, well, right. just going back to, sorry, Marcus.
Oh no, you're right. I was just going to say that yeah, and on that point too, we see much what happens occurs in Francia at a similar time as it happens in Germany. We see this genesis of geographic linkages to place names. So the Bavarian peoples, we have the name Bavaria for the province or the region. We have the same with Swabia, with Franconia, which becomes Franken in modern German. This starts to materialize at this time in concert with this. I mean, I suppose the ethnogenesis has happened, but this linguistogenesis is occurring at this time simultaneously.
Yes, and this is the emergence of Old High German. So beforehand we had Proto-Germanic, dating back to our conversation on ancient Germany, and then we have the division into the West and the East German Germanic dialects. The Goths in the East, of course, being the continuers of that linguistic tradition, which ends around the 15th century. When it comes to the West Germanic tradition, in 750, so around again the beginning of Charlemagne's reign, we see the emergence of Old High German, which is a continuous tradition of written text in a discernible language. Although in terms of like when this in an oral tradition started, it probably dated back to the just after the end of the Roman Empire, the 6th century, and we're talking about the districts between the Rhine and the Elbe, of course, not the other German districts. I mean, the Franks in Neustria and Austrasia had, as I mentioned, adopted Gallo-Romance, which is the precursor to the Langue d'Oil. But the Franks north of the Meuse, also had their own distinct linguistic heritage as well, because they weren't susceptible to the second sound shift, which basically marks the creation of a Germanic language. And this is where we have the breaking off not just of German from French, but we also have the breaking off of Flemish and Dutch from German as well. And this is where we get the creation of Lower Franconian or Neerlandic language. And this, again, as you mentioned, Columba, one of the stem tribes of the Frisians. And the Frisians are going to have, a marked influence. Basically, the North Sea region in general doesn't go through this sound shift. In terms of like the other tribes, of course, we have,
can I ask a question? I was
sure.
just going to say, because German, you see it a lot. It's sort of described by many people, some perhaps but a bit scornfully, as a sort of pig Latin. I've heard this tossed around before. And so at this period, with the genesis of Old High German, of course they're not totally adopting the Gallo-Romance languages or a vulgar Latin. But how much Latin influence, if any, are we seeing in this period?
Very much Latin influence in terms of the alphabet they use. I mean, obviously,
yes,
we have,
definitely.
And this, goes back, right from the beginning. Even the first sort of runes were influenced by Latin script in general. In terms of like Latin in general, I'm not a professional linguist, so I won't be able to say in terms of like the subtle intricacies. But very much, I think it's fair to say that obviously language like in English. I mean, English absorbs a huge amount of Latin words, but when it comes to German, again, I can't really say just in terms of the distinct nature of Old High German how prevalent Latin was, but I would say relative to French and relative to Italian, which are again the basically the successors of the Vulgar Latin and Gallic dialects, it's considerably less influence, even though
perhaps more so than England at this period.
Probably, but probably again, English language is already very distinct from the Old High German as well, because like Nederlandic, it doesn't go through the second sound shift. So English at this time is sounding a lot more like Dutch than it is something like modern English as well.
I mean, you notice that to this day. I mean, Dutch does have a sort of, at least to my ear, a sort of English twang to it.
And particular Frisian dialects of Dutch.
Yes. So just in terms of like the other tribes, I mean, we already mentioned Bavarian, Thuringian, Frisian, Franks, of course, in Franconia, which is the south, in this area in pink, Swabians, who are the successors of the Alemanni, etc. So they all have some sort of tribal predecessor which groups this. And this is why, in German, probably, even today, the German language is divided with all of these very distinct regional dialects, especially between the upper, central, and lower German dialects, which we're going to see. In terms of like the political ramifications of this, originally the duchies have been, and the counties have been directly appointed by the Frankish kings, and this change during this period where these dukes begin to assume the positions of hereditary fiefdoms, hereditary possessions. In terms of like the legal implications, I mean, these divisions wouldn't be broken up really until the 13th and the 14th centuries, and the legal systems in these regions would continue until the 14th century as well. So it's possible that East Francia could have simply broken up into these new polities that were created. But one of the remarkable things is that East Francia doesn't break up. It manages to maintain a unity of all of these German stem duchies, all of these German polities. So with the death of Louis the Child in 911, rather than leading to a civil war amongst the duchies, we have the election of one of the dukes. So we have the election of Conrad I of Franconia in Forchheim, and they were elected by a broad assembly of all the nobility in Germany. So this, again, you can say marks the fact that East Francia and the Frankish influence was able to exert a lasting impression, in the sense that it imposed German unity, and German unity was able to survive the conquest, and was able to survive the dissolution of the Carolingian Empire, and it was able to survive the death of the last Carolingian king, Louis the Child.
But it does, but at the exact same time, preserve these very old and explicitly German. I don't want to say democratic, but elective, traditions.
Yes, I think in terms of like seeing this as democratic or German, I mean, this is also happening in France. I mean, the notion of elected monarchy is happening really everywhere in the post-Roman world. The idea of sort of primogeniture really only sort of establishes later. Ironically, you can say in Germany, it was almost looking to be established, as we're going to discuss. And then, history sort of took a dark turn for Germany in terms of its history towards centralization, and it reversed. And countries like France, who had been more decentralized, became more decentralized. But just in terms of talking about trends that were set that will, continue over throughout the rest of German history. All the way back from Arnulf of Carinthia, who I mentioned was the bastard usurper of Charles the Fat. There had been a convention of the archbishops of Mainz, of Cologne, and Trier to confirm his position as king. And as sort of historians of the Holy Roman Empire will know, these three principal archbishoprics will then become prince electors of the Holy Roman Empire. So this idea that the three principal bishops of Germany convene and they ratify the election of the emperor begins with Arnulf. There's also the notion of anointing and sanctifying the king also happens during this time, in addition to an election. And again, the whole basis of the anointment is that one is transformed, one is assuming the mantle of Christ in terms of the position of sacred kingship, literally.
But we should note that we should note that there are a lot of sort of varieties of interpretation here, right? Because I mean, somebody who's more of a sort of of the papal view might view this as or somebody who argues that the church has supremacy in this period will say well look, they're ratifying it, but then I mean, we've both been digging a little bit into Evola for this. Evola has this idea that when the king is anointed or chosen by the bishops, it's not the bishops sort of imputing this power, it's more the bishops allowing or going on with this process, which reveals and enhances the already inherent
it's
nature
more
of the king.
Yes, it's more of a recognition than an investment.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
Yes. So yes, before we get onto the Magyar invasions, there just a couple of points I want to make. Henry the Fowler is someone we're going to be talking about in terms of the creation of the Ottonian dynasty. Even during Henry the Fowler, there was a civil war against Arnulf of Bavaria. But again, the civil war wasn't to try and disintegrate these duchies into new sort of constituent kingdoms, but it was over the claim to the entirety of the kingdom. And Henry the Fowler tried to, again, insist on the inviolability of the kingdom in law. In terms of like the significance of this, what we're going to see in the tradition of the new Holy Roman Empire, as distinct from the Carolingians and the Merovingian dynasty, is the fact that the Holy Roman Empire is not repeatedly partitioned in the same way that the Carolingians do. The irony, of course, being that in spite of the fact that the imperial line does not partition and create these constant civil wars over, the various new kingdoms being set up, the empire will disintegrate anyway, and the position will sort of fade away into an elected monarchy during the 14th century. In terms of like the longevity of these immediate stem duchies, I've already talked about how most of them lasted until the 13th and 14th centuries. I think it's important to note that Franconia, despite being the holder of the imperial family, breaks up very quickly afterwards, after the Attonians assume the mantle under Henry the Fowler, and it becomes, a series of ecclesiastical and noble principalities, one of which is going to be the progenitor of the Salian dynasty, that of the German city of Worms. And in terms of the Lotharingia, as we mentioned, that is going to break up. So we're going to have Lorraine as, what we can recognize BC today as, modern Lorraine in France, and Lower Lotharingia, which is going to represent, the Benelux countries, so Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium. These states are going to be created this time. But there's probably one more point I'd like to mention. I mean, you come up with comparisons to France, Columba. But I think one noteworthy comparison is that because the Franks didn't establish a consolidated base of power in Germany first, there was no natural center or natural capital. And that's going to be something during this entire time. There was no overarching sort of linguistic and culturally and economically dominant area in Germany at this time. I mean, if you look at the capital of Germany today, which is in Brandenburg and the area of Mecklenburg as well, were basically uninhabited at this point. There was no way anyone at this point thought that this would be a natural place to establish a German government. Whereas in France, as we mentioned, you have the domain of Soissons, the kingdom of Soissons. That center of Roman culture becomes the natural center of France throughout its entire history. And Paris is associated as the capital of France right at the beginning of Clovis. But when it comes to Germany, you're going to see the imperial capital move periodically, as with the hereditary position of the domains of the emperor himself. So, whether that be in Swabia, whether that be in Worms, whether that be in Austria, whether that be in Prague, whether the imperial chancellery be in Frankfurt or Regensburg, talk about other imperial cities such as Nuremberg, there is going to be no center of power. And so, ironically, despite the fact that the unity of Germany is, consolidated during this period in the aftermath of the Carolingians, there is no permanent center of power, which is going to be associated with a royal dynasty, which is going to grow like the Capetian demesnes and become a centralized kingdom.
In relation to this, sorry, Marcus, I just wanted to quickly say that in relation to this, oh God, I can't remember, but I watched something not long ago about this idea that even though it's unified, there is a lot of there's no clear sort of base of power. There's a lot of different bases of power, and things move extensively. And the guy who I was watching argued that this was one of the prime reasons for the really high density of castles and forts that you see in Germany, because the base of power moves so often, and so you'll have a wide variety of castles and all sorts of constructions all over the place, because I mean it's sort of such marshalling of resources, it follows where the power goes, and if for one century a couple of particular dukedoms are quite powerful, then you begin to see vast constructions popping up there more than you do in other places. Whereas in France, a lot of constructions are focused and intensified in the center of the country.
Marcus?
What I was just going to say on the point of you're making about capitals and the cities of this early sort of proto-German state is that the most developed cities, arguably at this point in time, at the very beginning of the Ottonian Dynasty, would be now, considering context also that we've had a period of stability under the Merovingians and Carolingians, and there would have been some recovery, but obviously these borderlands of the former Roman Empire would have been quite, or not destitute, but definitely overrun in the Great Migration period and the collapse of the Western Empire. But it would be cities such as Mainz, which was Roman Mogontiacum, and Trier, which was Augusta Treverorum, would have been the more built up. And of course, what was the Roman name for it? Was it
Colonia Agrippina, I think.
Agrippinensis, I think.
Oh, Agrippinensis. Thank you.
Oh, one of those two. And and so, they're right along the Rhine and would have been, and because of the river, the situation, them being situated close to the Rhine, would have more access to sort of trade and would be strategically important. Whereas, for instance, we associate the modern day. You go to travel to Bavaria, and the capital is Munich. I mean, Munich hasn't even been founded at this point. Munich, if anything, might be a small village or a hamlet.
Yes, I mean in Bavaria, Regensburg and Augsburg were, the prominent centers of power. Munich essentially was virtually non-existent. You mentioned
Exactly right.
Trier, Mainz, and Cologne. Again, what's important to note is that these are also the seats of the principal bishops and archbishops of
Correct.
Germany.
Yes.
So this is the center of administration, and it's also the center of Christian culture as well. And as we're going to see throughout the discussion, is that Mainz in particular is the primate of Germany is based in Mainz. Basically, the Archbishop of Mainz is often the imperial chancellor, and very early on, the Ottonians and the Salians will have this relationship with the Archbishopric of Mainz, which is very conducive towards managing the church, the Catholic Church in Germany, which accelerates you can almost say the near autocratic power of the Ottonian and Salian dynasties.
Absolutely, and that might possibly have its roots in the establishment of the diocese under sort of Diocletian, if you go back that far. Like the fact that these churches and locations of these cities begin to accumulate that sort of civil responsibility that far back, and with the collapse of the empire, the collapse of imperial authority, you have this increasing prominence of the church in these areas, and then with the onset of the Frankian Empire, they sort of take up the vacuum, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean they were definitely the sort of the cores of the civilizing force of the church. I mean, we've talked about these early forays into spreading wine agriculture and things like this, and the building of monasteries and stone building and all these things. Yeah, they all take off, and they all take off along the the sort of the riverbeds in the south, I suppose, where conditions are a bit more favorable for that sort of that sort of growing.
Absolutely.
Great. So I think that's, unless anyone else has anything to say, I think that's quite a good introduction to how East Francia sort of evolved into Germany and what Germany looked like. I think one point to extend that point you made about Castles Columba is that the map you see here, which is the Holy Roman Empire at the beginning, where you have these stem duchies and you see these German dialects actually roughly corresponding to political units. This is going to be probably the most united and consolidated these regions are going to be throughout the entire of the empire's history.
It gets quite absurd.
So unlike in France, where these regions will consolidate, these regions will disintegrate further and further and further and further until the 18th century, where I believe there are almost 400 separate polities during this time. I mean, even the larger ones, such as Bavaria. I mean, the state of Bavaria, the Duchy of Bavaria, just before the Napoleonic Wars, only corresponded to, at best, half of the territory you could see from the old Duchy of Bavaria during this time. You're probably the only territory which was, roughly continuous is the Duchy of Bavaria, Duchy of Bohemia, you see here, which will then sort of grow into the Kingdom of Bohemia. In terms of some, territorial entity which retains its form throughout this time, I think that's probably one of the only examples. Possibly Saxony as well, but when you look at when you look at Lower Saxony in particular, and when you look at Franconia, and when you look at Swabia, all of these regions are just going to dissipate into tiny little fief principalities and ecclesiastical domains as well.
Yeah,
so
sorry, I just wanted to make one point, which is that I suppose when one considers that one can understand how it played into Napoleon's propaganda scheme and his idea and his own ideas about Charlemagne, coming in and dealing with this extremely complex situation with all these little tribes or what have you. But that's just a thought I had.
I'm just trying to remember, did Napoleon make the Archbishop of Mainz the primate of Germany?
He might have.
Yes.
That would be worth looking into. Yeah.
Yes. So moving on to the military side of this discussion, we're going to talk about the perennial threat to Europe during this time, which is during the 9th and the 10th centuries, which were the Magyar invasions. Just to give like a little context on, the Magyars, who are obviously the Hungarians. I mean, Hungary is like a Latin term received into English, which I believe denotes the united tribes of the Magyars. But in Hungary is known as Magyarország, or the state of Hungary. In terms of like the origins of the Magyars, there was an assumption that they, in the same way that the Poles claimed to be the heirs of the Sarmatians, the Magyars claimed to be the descendants of the Scythians and even the Huns. And of course, now there's a common confusion that the modern day Hungarians are descendants of the Huns. But this has been completely dispelled by the fact that their language Hungarian, is related to the Uralic languages in the Ural Mountains in Russia, which again only sort of bears close similarity with those regions and with Finland. So we have this grouping, the Finno-Ugric group. So the assumption now is that having been nomads around, probably perhaps even east of the Ural Mountains, thousands of years ago, they began migrating from that region during, just after the Hunnic invasions to, basically, you can see on this map, what is now sort of southern Russia and southern Ukraine, which is the Kuban and the Donbass regions, during the 830s. And during this time, they became very closely associated with the Khazar Khaganate, which was the dominant nomadic Turkish empire during this time. And so from that, we have quite a lot of assimilation and quite a lot of root Turkic words that are sort of inherited into the Magyar language. Nevertheless, it's important to note the Magyars, from their ethnogenesis, are part of this Uralic group, deriving from from Western Siberia, Eastern Russia. From this time, they begin to form a tribal confederation, and they begin to start attacking the Slavs who have already migrated into most of Eastern Europe during this point. And they begin their first raids. And again, just in terms of like justifying, why these raids happening and why they became so ferocious. Another Turkic group after the Khazar Khaganate, known as the Pechenegs, drove the Magyars from their original homeland, which the Hungarians called Etelkos, which corresponds to this region around the Kuban and Donbass, causing them to cross the Carpathians and settle in Pannonia. I think it's also quite interesting is that this isn't the first time a nomadic tribe has done this. We've already had the Avars in particular, who have taken over the Pannonian region and used it to launch raids all across Europe. But the raids of the Magyars are really something to behold. I mean, in 862. The Hungarians first raid into East Francia, then would later become the Kingdom of Germany. And I think it's also important to note the Hungarians aren't Christianized yet. So
they're still pagans.
Yes, under their Grand Prince Arpad, who founds the first royal dynasty of Hungary, which will last until the 14th century. They are pagans. After having, allied with the Slavs in Moravia under Svatopluk, who was probably the founder of one of the greatest Slavic polities at this time.
But they did also subjugate a lot of the Slavs, right?
Oh yes, yes, and immediately after this alliance, which ensured the settlement of the Pannonian Basin, Moravia was basically destroyed by the Hungarians, and this caused the creation of the modern Duchy of Bohemia, which was the remnant of this great Slavic principality known as Greater Moravia. In terms
we can see that they're in their route of attack, it's pretty much straight along the Danube into the basin and into the regions that we were just discussing as this sort of agricultural and administrative heartland, I suppose, right? Because it's heading straight into the south and the fertile river valleys where most of the agricultural development of the country had taken place.
Absolutely, but they don't just stop here. I mean, as we mentioned,
no, they do not.
With the unfortunate reign of Louis, the appropriately named child. The Hungarians, obviously ruin Moravia. They attack Berengar II in Italy. I think actually no, Berengar I. I think it's important to note that Berengar was basically the last emperor of this weird period between the Carolingian demise and the creation of the Holy Roman Empire, where, as Columba mentioned, the imperial office was just, an empty sort of vessel where, people claimed it, but it didn't really mean anything. He was the last emperor, and he was facing a huge amount of these Hunnic raids into Italy during the 10th century. I think it's also important to note, just for Italian history in particular, there's a moment in papal history called the Secellum Obscurum, which means the Dark Age, but this could be applied to all of Italy in general. I mean, it's a period of constant strife and corruption, and the Magyars get as far as Apulia in the heel of Italy. They get as far as the Pyrenees, and they actually cross over, I think, in the 940s, and they actually attack Catalonia. They attack France. They repeatedly attack Saxony, which is on the frontier. They repeatedly attack Moravia. And
we should explain that the reason why they're able to move so extensively is because, again, in the tradition of these peoples who had come from the east, like the Huns before them, such groups like that, they were a horse-loving people, right? I mean they were attached to their horses, and they were fantastic mounted archers and things like this, and so they just ran rings around the European armies of the time.
Yes, you might call them a born in the saddle civilization of sorts.
Yes, definitely.
Yes, these were, the Magyars were probably the penultimate sort of great nomadic invader in Europe before we get to the Mongols in the 13th century. So yes, we have, first of all, it's the Huns, then it's the Avars, and then, during the early medieval era, it's the Magyars. And through this constant conquest and constant raids, they were able to acquire sort of tributary relations with most of the European powers at this point. And just, talking about the demise of the Carolingian Empire and its army, we talked about how the Vikings were able to attack Paris during the reign of Charles the Fat. Well, they had subjugated Eastern Francia into this form of tributary relationship, which is only broken by King Henry the Fowler at the Battle of Merseburg in 932. And this sort of really gets on to the most important part of this discussion, which is the Ottonian Dynasty. In terms of what's going to happen with the Magyars, in terms of the climactic battle between them, we'll cover that when we get to Otto the Great. But before we do that, I probably want to discuss the origins of the Ottonian dynasty. The assumption is that the Ottonians, who started off as the Liudolfings, were actually quite sort of minor. The assumption is that during the old Saxon Principality, which had been a constant war with the Franks, that they were ministeriales, i.e. there were serfs who, freedmen in the Roman world, had risen to the point of effective counselors and ministers of the various tribal chieftains. They didn't have any sort of exalted ancestry in that sense, and it was through these positions that they've been able to successfully marry. But only did they become prominent after the Frankish conquest. Before the Frankish conquest, they were very minor. I think it's again Liudolf who begins his position as a Saxon count, and later is able to attain the position of duke, and even and this is important, is able to marry into the dynasty by marrying his daughter Liutgard to one of the Carolingian kings of East Germany's son, Louis the Younger, son of Louis the German. So from very humble beginnings as magistrates, the Liudolfing Ottonian house is able to establish quite a lot of lands and quite a lot of titles within the vicinity of Saxony. I think one sort of bit of historical irony is that Otto the Illustrious, who is Liudolf's son, I believe his mother was it's Matilda of no, actually no, it was Henry the Fowler. Marries Matilda of Ingelheim, the descendant of Widukind. And of course, Widukind was the great sort of Saxon, not quite Arminius figure, but almost like
led the revolt
against Charlemagne.
Against Charlemagne.
Yes, against repeatedly. So eventually, the Ottonians would marry into the descendants of the House of Widukind. You can almost say Germanizing this region and really sort of establishing how the Franks had had basically achieved their enemy's aim for them in consolidating the rule, not just of Germans, but also of a Saxon dynasty over over Germany as a whole, considering the Saxons had been the perennial foes of the Franks. The main difference, of course, being that the Saxons were no longer pagan. The Ottonians were devoutly Catholics, as would be their successor dynasty, the Salians, and they would continue this. So
do you think to some extent it's possible that when building their power base, the Ottonians were in some sense benefiting from a lingering resentment amongst the Saxons and the sort of certain segments of the Germans against the ruling dynasty?
It's very difficult to say, simply because in terms of like the iconography of the position of the emperor, they kept using the title of Franks. There wasn't any rush to drop the position of King of the Franks. And Henry the Fowler, upon assuming this position, would adopt the title of King of the Franks. In fact, the position of sort of King of the Germans is really only sort of comes into the fore in the 12th century, when it's basically seen as analogous as, King of the Romans, King of the Germans, basically signifying not just rule over Germany, but also your sort of preparatory stage once you've been elected before you get crowned as Holy Roman Emperor.
And as you mentioned, Henry the Fowler, of course, he was elected by the nobles, and so he doesn't have absolute power. There's always that contention there.
But this is what sort of, you can say, distinguishes the Ottonians from their successors. As we mentioned, Henry
they gradually centralized, right? Yeah. Henry
the Fowler wasn't the first king of the post-Carolingian era in East Francia. He was the second. Conrad of Franconia had been elected before him, and the family had basically been completely dispossessed once they had lost that imperial dignity through a royal dignity, through election. And Henry began to consolidate his support, and he consolidated his support by basically, you can say, creating a new form of monarchy. On the one hand, it was bolstered by his military victories, say, for example, as the one I've mentioned against the Hungarians at Merseburg. But also he would establish a principle of united succession. So he was very keen that when he died, he wouldn't want to inherit and dissolve the empire, amongst his various sons. He wanted his son Otto, later Otto the Great, to inherit the empire whole. And this, in terms of the Carolingian dynasty, this marks, an incredible sort of change. I mean, if any dynasty was going to actually dissolve East Francia, it was going to be the Carolingians through their constant attempts to parcel out, all the realms amongst all of the sons, all of which had an equal inheritance. If Henry the Fowler is to be credited with anything, on top of his military victories, he subjugates the Bavarians again, consolidates the realm, begins this process of centralization, and establishes a form of primogeniture, which is going to lead this principality up to this point, this kingdom of East Francia, united to be inherited by his son Otto. In terms of like their hereditary position, they're still sort of only dukes of Saxony, so he doesn't sort of inherit the position, but he's in a position where he's elected, and it's basically within the first sort of few years of Otto's reign. He has to fight, quite a lot of nobles who were chafing under the more centralized rule of his father, Henry the Fowler. And Otto is able to successfully sort of put off all of these attempts to curb his royal power. And you can say that really Otto establishes the dynasty as, centralizing, domineering, and also based on divine right, and again completely abandoning this idea of the individual sort of succession of all of the princes, this consolidated empire under a divine sort of imperial head, because he will become emperor during the course of his lifetime. He faces like opposition perennially across from his own family, because one of the effects of creating the one succession is that all of the sons now want to take over.
You have a bunch of angry boys.
Yes. You have a lot of angry brothers. So both his brother Henry and his half brother Tankmar try and overthrow him sort of very early onwards. And there's a brief rebellion from the nominal ally again of the Atonian Dynasty, the Archbishop of Mainz. Although this is quickly defeated. The Bavarians again rise up under Eberhard. If one sort of faction is in a position to actually challenge the Saxon dynasty is going to be the Bavarians. Nevertheless, Otto defeats Eberhard and removes the then ruling dynasty of Bavaria, and he places his brother Henry onto the Bavarian throne, which will later, inherit the imperial title onwards. In terms of like his overall expansion, he is able to incorporate the Duchy of Bohemia, the remnant of the former Greater Moravia, into his empire, and this will be consolidated in 104 when it formally joins the Holy Roman Empire after adopting this like suzerain position, and it will be later elevated to the Kingdom of Bohemia. So we see a great expansion. Although his first expedition in Italy really quite fails. He basically claims that Berengar II, the King of Italy, is illegitimate, and he has a more direct claim to the throne. But first of all, he's repulsed, and this is where we get to the great sort of military success. And I'll give an outline, and probably Marcus can elucidate a bit more detail on this, which is the Battle of Lechfeld. Essentially, 10,000 horse archers under a Hungarian chieftain known as Bukshu, invades southern Germany, and the armies meet at Lechfeld near modern-day Augsburg. And the army under Otto the Great is able to defeat this primarily using heavy cavalry. And after the battle, there's such a disastrous retreat of the Hungarian cavalry, partly due to the weather conditions, that Otto is able to capture all of the Hungarian leaders and execute them, with the exception of the new Grand Prince who sort of retreats to Hungary. And in terms of like the effectiveness of this battle, which I'll probably give over to Marcus in a second, it stops the campaigns westward from Hungary. Hungary now sort of launches campaigns only against the Byzantine Empire.
And Balkans,
one of the lasting effects of this, you can say the defeat of the Magyars in terms of their invasion westward, is that Hungary, unlike the Avars, unlike the Huns before them, does the remarkable in that it changes from a basically nomadic group occupying, the traditional sort of basin to which launch attacks, which is the Carpathian Pannonian Basin, and they transform into a medieval kingdom. This doesn't, occur immediately, but it's established under the rule of King Saint Stephen from 1000 onwards, who embarks on the consolidation and the Christianization of the state of Hungary.
And I think this is in large part, seems to me anyway, a result of their desire to have stable diplomatic relations. Basically, I mean, they realize that unless they unless they convert and unless they fully take part in the system and settle down, so to speak, they're not going to get anything meaningful, I suppose.
And of course, the Christianization process, aids and abets the process of settling down and harmonizing diplomatic relations, rather than allowing the Holy Roman Empire to have a constant casus belli against the Hungarians to invade and bring them into the Christian fold. But before I move on, Marcus, is there anything you want to say on the Battle of Lechfeld and the Magyars?
Sure. I think I'll start on Lechfeld by saying that there were also two preceding battles. One also at Lechfeld a little earlier. So the Battle of Lechfeld, led by King Otto, was the victory of 955, where although the Germans themselves do suffer heavy losses, they essentially, like you described, destroyed the Hungarian force. The vast majority of its leaders were killed. The Hungarians were sent in essentially rout out of Bohemia as a result, and essentially don't threaten the Holy Roman Empire beyond this point. Certainly not with the same degree of ferocity and present danger in which they had done before. But prior to Lechfeld 55, you have Lechfeld 910, also known as the Battle of Augsburg, which is much the same, and that there was a much smaller engagement where 5,000 to 7,000 Hungarians fought approximately a German army, or a Holy Roman army of approximately, I think, to 12 to 15,000, to my knowledge. I don't know a lot about it because details about the battle are rather scant anyway. But prior to the Battle of Lechfeld 910, you actually have the Battle of Pressburg in 907, and that there, in fact, was a very existential catastrophe for Louis the Child, because this occurred during Louis the Child's reign, where the vast majority of the forces which could be mustered by the Margrave of Bavaria, I'm trying to think of the Margrave's name at this point, I've just gone blank, but the forces essentially of the eastern portion of the the Holy Roman Empire are destroyed in this battle. The sources say 60,000. I don't believe 60,000 is a correct figure. I think it's more like, say, 40,000. But nonetheless, they come across an army of approximately 15,000 Hungarians and are destroyed. The armies of the Margrave of Bavaria and the Archbishopric of Salzburg are defeated and destroyed. So from this period from 907 to 955, the Magyars are not just a thorn in the side of the Holy Roman Empire, but are very much an existential threat. They are being raided relentlessly. And the Magyars, if I may just wind back a little bit, have this essentially etched tradition in sort of their psyche of raiding. Like you say, they very much are forged in this Pontic step tradition of the Sarmatians, of the Magyars, and they're kind of they come a little bit after the Avars, but the Avars and to some degree also the Bulgars, who play a bit of a role in this story, because the Hungarians also fight periodically with the Bulgars, but after the Bulgarians score success against the Byzantine Empire in the Balkans, the Bulgars are far more able to resist the Magyars and actually check their expansion into the Balkans, at least through the 800-900s, which is why the Magyars actually turned north initially against the, if I may call, the nascent German state, the proto-German Empire here, and so the Magyars, they actually have a word for this. I'm just trying to actually find where I've written it down. The Hungarians actually have a term for this. They call it, and I'm sorry if any Hungarians in the chat if I'm totally butchering this word, but they call
Hungarian's
it
hard.
they call it the Honfoglagas, which is in essence conquest of the homeland. They call it land taking, and they have been pursuing this shall I say manifest dynasty of the manifest destiny of the Magyar people since they were in the steppe from the time of Christ, and they have gradually raided their way westwards and westwards and westwards and taken land till they eventually settle in the Pannonian Plain, and so that brings us to the events of 955 in the Battle of Lechfeld, and we see to some degree we kind of see a little bit of it with the Battle of Tours Poitiers in an infantry context with the Franks against the Arabs. What we see here at Lechfeld is the cavalry equivalent, where we start to see this origin point of the primacy of heavy Western cavalry, this mental picture we have of knights on horseback fighting as heavy mounted cavalry in the Western tradition, and they do not just check the Hungarians, but they very much massacre them and hold them to their borders.
How as a tactical question, I suppose.
Sure.
How with heavy cavalry would you go about defeating horse archers? Because it seems to me like they would be able to outmaneuver you quite easily.
Well, that's the thing, and that's sort of what is the great sort of question about the Battle of Lechfeld itself. But if I can perhaps pull something from the Byzantine because there's several books about strategy from the Byzantine Empire, several manuals, and one of their maxims was, when fighting in the east, fight as you would in the west, and when you fight in the west, fight as you would in the east, and that can be interpreted a number of ways. But say with heavy cavalry, if you're fighting, say, near rivers or near swamps, I would suggest, or depending if I say winter and there's just the ground is sodden, the potentially the contrast of, say, the speed of the horse traveling is reduced. The contrast is reduced between heavy and light cavalry. The other thing as well, if you consider the old maxim, I think it's a Roman one, where they say that an ambush discovered can repay its intended mischief with interest. if heavy cavalry is able to draw horse archers in, or at least a portion of an army, and then still flank from beyond the horse archers' own flanks, it can attack it from two positions at once. It is possible, which is why, say, for instance, it is easier for horse archers to not be outflanked, say, at Carrhae, at Ctesiphon, like in the Syrian desert or what have you. There's less of an ability to sort of flank behind cover, whereas, if you consider Lechfeld or Pressburg is in modern-day Slovakia, we have forests in Europe. We have, swamplands
hills
and
as well.
marshes
Yeah,
and
you
hills
can
and whatever.
hide and surprise. Yeah.
And that sort of tactical ability, that operational ability, I mean, they're not operational is the right word in this context, but this sort of battlefield ability to disguise heavy cavalry, move them behind horse archers is not out of the question. And
it's quite an advanced maneuver, though. It's quite impressive.
It is, and also too, we see this referenced a little bit in the Crusades. In the Crusader period, is there instances whether it's the Turks, whether it's the Seljuks through Anatolia, whether it's the Battle of I mentioned the previous stream, we talked about the crossing of the Orontes River and how the foot knights mimicked the Testudo, or whether it was later on in campaigns in the County of Edessa or what have you. The fact that the Europeans these knights start to fight in this very heavily armored fashion would actually protect them far more greatly than, say, a lighter soldier from a past era. So that would also, to some degree, perhaps negate the effectiveness of archery on horseback.
Of course, yeah, because I mean, at this period, we're beginning to see the first sort of major developments in medieval craftsmanship, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the sort of nascence of the guild systems as well, and all this, and military technology, especially armor, seems to really take off around the 1000s, at least to my knowledge.
Absolutely, and also too, you probably at this point in time, maybe not in other ways. I mean, we see it in castle building, but not necessarily, say, in civic infrastructure in terms of aqueducts or fountains, for instance. But at this point in time, the sort of 900s to 1000 to 1100 AD, we sort of see this technological catch up to where Rome might have been in the last century and a half of its existence, when metallurgy is probably, bridge that gap, that deficiency that might have existed in the previous century or two. Metalworking.
Oh, I
we see it.
No, I was just going to say, one could argue, I mean, in terms of fineness and craftsmanship, I mean, even if you look at stuff like the Sutton Hoo Horde, and I mean the Germanics, even when they're in a very primitive and wandering state, do incredible work with gold and their smithing in general. And so, yeah, once they settle down and they begin to have access to this wider infrastructure, the German craft tradition takes off in a way that I would argue, I mean, surpasses. I mean, if you look at the plate armor of the Middle Ages, it surpasses, to my mind, anything from the ancient world.
But in my estimation, it's this sort of period, this sort of 200 or 300 years, where that technological crossover happens, and I think we start to see it certainly in equipment. Not necessarily for like levied foot soldiers, because I mentioned the Battle of Pressburg. It was essentially the levy army of the Margrave of Bavaria that's annihilated. So it would have been what the Franks call a Heerban, a levy, which was largely destroyed by the
so Magyars, basically a bunch of poor souls with pitchforks and maybe a tin hat.
They would have been comparable to, say, the Ferdmen that were massacred at Hastings in 1066, because and Bavarian culture wouldn't have been too dissimilar in that context, certainly from a military context.
Yes.
One more point I want to make, because I'm probably sure that AM does want to move on, but a really, really good source, and I haven't had a copy of this for a long time, and I've been meaning to get one and I can't. But for anyone interested in this time period, one of the best things to read is, and I'm sure we'll touch on this further when we get to Italy and also Byzantium, but the Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus, the Constantine VII, wrote a book called De Administrando Imperio, which means basically the book of imperial administration. And he makes a very interesting observation about the Hungarians. And for those who don't know, this book is written by an emperor, by the Byzantine emperor, and his court essentially contribute to this. And it's a book from his time period, writing about all the people who live beyond the empire. So he writes about the Avars, the Pechenegs, the Proto-Turks, the Arabs, etc. It's a very, very interesting book. It's a very good book, and that really has no comparison almost in history to the degree in which an emperor writes about people beyond his realm. It's quite the insight. But in this book, he actually refers to erroneously the Magyars as being Turkoi or Turkia or Turkoi in Greek, but it's not an ethnic distinction. What it is that the Magyars, being sort of from as AM said, from the Uralic language group, speak a Finno-Ugric language, which is connected to Turkish or like Proto-Turkish in a way, but they are not Turkish and they're not actually Turkish speakers. But they sort of, because they have a similar origin point, they have these similarities, but their ethnogenesis is not remotely Turkish, and that is sometimes confused when people refer to them as Turks.
I see.
It can be misunderstood. And also, like cultural traits, like Avars, Pechenegs, the Kumans even, and Magyars, because of this origin point from the steppe, they obviously are going to share traits, cultural traits, traits in military culture,
in their
military
religion,
philosophy, in religion, etc. And hence why this confusion can permeate. I hope that covers it, AM.
No,
Perfect,
that's wonderful. Thank you very much for that. So moving on from the military history, there's one point I really want to touch on before we have the imperial consecration, which is the Ottonian relation with the church. I've already mentioned how they start off with this effective relationship with the Archbishop of Mainz, which is the primate of Germany, and basically, the archbishops of Cologne, Trier, and Mainz are basically, the principal sort of administrators, the centers of culture and Christian civilization in Germany. Well, from after the Battle of Lechfeld, Otto is able to effect a more autocratic policy as it concerns the church, and with regards to his nobles, because this is part of a two-pronged attack. He establishes what is known as a proprietary church, where basically the king begins this alliance with the church, where he invests them with more property, more taxes. I mean, basically the extension of tithes throughout all of Europe really starts with the reign of Otto. The investment of church land and church tithes and church taxes, again, so much so, the power of the church was such that bishops could even begin to raise armies during this point, and this is going to be something will carry on throughout the Holy Roman Empire through most of its history. When you see, right up until I believe it's 1803, vast amounts of the Holy Roman Empire consist of these Prince Bishophorics or Prince Archbishophorics, whether they be the Prince Archbishop of Munster or the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg. These territories, which are the domain of an ecclesiastical minister of the church, who also have taxation authorities, also run a local government administration, and also have armies of their own.
Yes, they're quite militaristic. I mean, it's not just restricted to Germany. It's a phenomenon that you see across the medieval world. I mean, there are a number of examples from Scottish history as well. I remember learning, multiple bishops during the wars of independence, and they even fought in battles. One of them wielded a mace, apparently, which tells you about Scotland at the time, I suppose.
So in terms of why the emperor did this, why he decided to wed the Atonian Dynasty with the church, it was so that every sort of single administrative position in his royal chancellery, even like his court chaplains, would be appointed to run bishophorics, to run monasteries. Clerks and lay people would become bishops. And they would be personally invested by the king, later emperor. The point of this was that the emperor wanted a check against the power of the nobility, and investing the nobility with these positions of administration always had the risk that they would fall into some sort of hereditary officialdom, like what happened in France towards the end before the revolution. And so investing it in a ecclesiastical official, the basis was that once the ecclesiastical official died, he could not inherit that post.
So what he's trying to do is he's trying to not create an aristocracy. He's trying to create a bureaucracy.
He's trying to create a bureaucracy who are entirely dependent on him. And by wedding himself with the church, and the church, of course, who are the continuers of Western civilization, the Western legal tradition, as well as, the ecclesiastical officials and administrators of the Catholic Church. This is all as a means to actually increase the central power of the king, who is dependent on the clergy as his administrators, rather than the nobility, who are basically sidelined. And this, again, is all for the purpose of giving the emperor, untrammeled autocratic power. And it would also actually sow the seeds of the ultimate demise of the dynasty when we get to the investiture controversy. With the church's backing and the power of the king sort of massively increased by, the bishops being dependent on him, and through this alliance with the bishops of Germany, you can almost say actually that the Archbishop of Mainz during this period was more powerful than the Pope, because the Pope was completely dependent on the Council of Tusculum, as we go to mention when we get to the Sacralium Obscurum and the reasons behind the investiture controversy, but and also the periodical point of, you can say, diminished influence for the church in the 10th century. The church in Germany was basically its own thing. It was virtually independent from the popes and under the direct control of the emperor, with his ability to invest bishops, which is going to be very important. But moving on from the Lechfeld again, one of the effects was that the emperorship had not been occupied for 38 years. Berengar had died, I think, in 924. And as we mentioned, the emperorship was virtually worthless at that point. It was a hangover of the Carolingian period, but the last actual Carolingian emperor was Charles the Fat. There hadn't been an effective emperor, even though many had laid claim to the title, and the title had been, unclaimed for 38 years at this point. And this, again, why I emphasize that Otto represents the tradition of the Holy Roman Empire much better than Charlemagne, who simply revives the office of the emperor, because the actual imperial administration of the Franks collapses very quickly and is inherited by many different political groups. That being the inheritor of both the Holy Roman Empire and of France, was rather the precursor. So going back to what the Battle of Lechfeld does, the army there acclaims Otto not only as the great father of the fatherland, of course referring to Germany, but also as emperor in the absence of a ruling emperor. Otto already had the claim on Italy through his first failed attempt to conquer Italy from Berengar II, and he is able to achieve the conquest of Italy in 961. And it's in 962 he is able to be crowned by John XII, one of the last popes of the Sacralium Obscurum, and he achieves this imperial coronation. And probably more so than any other coronation since Charlemagne, this is really ushering in a imperial dynasty, and through the Salian dynasty, which is also connected to the Atonian Dynasty, that will try and amass centralized autocratic power in a way that probably hadn't been seen, with the exception of Charlemagne, since the Roman emperors. In terms of what the emperor immediately wanted, he wanted to establish a archdiocese in Magdeburg. The point was that the emperors were very concerned about nomadic and Balkan raids from the east. So setting up an archbishopric right in the north of Germany, right on the border of what was sort of known civilization then with the Slavs, because the Germans hadn't expanded east during this point. It was meant to be like a center of Christianization going forward. Then we have the diploma Ottonianum, which establishes Otto as the secular protector of the church, and pivotally that the Pope needs to swear allegiance to the emperor despite an election in order to be confirmed.
We should also note that John XII, one of the reasons why he did this is because his family or he had a claim on the Duchy of Spoleto, right? And he wanted it back, basically.
Yes, and the confirmation of the donations of Pepin was a consideration that, again, a powerful warlord would confirm the various, the Duchy of Spoleto, of Perugia, of the Exarchate of Ravenna, etc., would be confirmed by a powerful warlord. Although this wasn't done, Otto basically held on to these territories, and in response, although I'll probably just want to finish this remark about the nature of imperial appointments, just to show how sort of enduring this is. Imperial sort of interference in papal elections lasted all the way up until the 20th century. The last sort of direct sort of imperial intervention was when Franz Joseph tried to veto one of the cardinals who were potentially could inherit who could potentially be elected to the position of Pope instead of Pius X, basically removing one of the candidates from contention. And once the Emperor Franz Joseph had done this, the elected Pope Pius X then basically threatened the emperor with excommunication if he would ever use that right again. So
Wow.
this is a very long history right up until the 20th century. But yes, going back to the nature of the papacy at this time, the Pope again was supposed to be sort of you could almost be elected by the clergy of Rome on the one hand, and there was also sort of popular affirmation that could elevate a pope at the same time. There wasn't a formal process which the pope could be elected up until 1059, when we have the process which is recognizable today, which is election via the College of Cardinals. And this process would be refined several times during the medieval period. But right back to John XII, and mention his original sort of territorial designs. Very quickly, he is frustrated with Otto, and also more concerned about Otto's, incredible power as master of this church in Germany, and as potential lord over all of Christendom. And so, John attempts to ally with Berengar II, the deposed king of Italy, and in response, the Emperor Otto appoints a new pope, Leo VIII, as a puppet pope, and this will establish a new tradition within imperial monarchs of them directly appointing popes, and as we'll see, anti-popes, whenever sort of there is some sort of imperial, contradiction with the wishes of a desired pope.
I believe we even get anti-kings at one point.
Oh yes, we get anti-kings when it comes to Henry IV, but that's a bit later on. So yes, we enter the period where the emperor is virtually supreme over the papacy. In terms of securing the realms in Italy, there are many times. I mean, I've already mentioned how Italy was very difficult to run. I mean, Arnulf, the king of Germany, who the last Carolingian sort of king of Germany in Italy, had basically had to rule it through force, and every time he left Italy, it basically became unruly, and he had to abandon it again, reconquer it. This happened with Otto. He leaves Italy, and in 966 he has to go into Italy and conquer it again after Ethelbert, a son of Berengar II, attempts to reconsolidate the territory again. I believe Otto appoints the Archbishop of Mainz. Again, this cements the idea of the Archbishop of Mainz as incredibly powerful and a pivotal ally for the Ottonians as regent of all Germany. And in terms of the imperial positions that emanate from this, there seems to be a precursor of the Reichsvicar, the imperial vicar, or the imperial deputy, who would invariably rule, when the emperor was absent. So the bishop, again, demonstrating the power of the emperor's control over the church, over this proprietary church, it was reliant on the clergy to rule Germany as he begins to go into Italy and try and consolidate it definitively, so he won't have to constantly invade and reconquer it and deal with all these popes who are constantly rebelling. He is able actually to, he does quite well. I think he conquers Capua, he conquers Benevento, he conquers Salerno. And it's actually at this point where the Byzantine Empire, or Eastern Roman Empire, is almost sort of deprived of all of its positions in Italy. And so right at the end of his reign, we have this remarkable turnabout where Otto actually marries his son, Otto II, who had named co-emperor, to Theophanu, one of the princesses of the Eastern Roman Empire at this time. In terms of
the Byzantines are also pressed from Sicily and the Caliphate that's in sort of based out of North Africa, right?
Yes, the Fatimid Caliphate. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Just on. I mean, we'll touch on this obviously more next week, but a lot of people don't realize that the struggle for Sicily took actually a couple hundred years. So the Byzantines and the Arabs are very much struggling for this small island. Meanwhile.
Yeah, and this isn't definitive. This isn't definitive conquest. I mean, in terms of, again, emphasizing the Roman nature of the Holy Roman Empire, and just for context, name of Holy Roman Empire is beyond this period. It actually, I think it was coined by Frederick II Barbarossa, Frederick I Barbarossa in the 12th century. So this idea of the Heiliges Romanisches Reich doesn't exist at this point, but they still use the title of Emperor of the Romans and sometimes Emperor of the Romans and the Franks. Nevertheless, in terms of, again, a Roman emperor, the Emperor Otto actually rules from Rome during this point, from 966, almost the end of his life, where he is trying to put down and consolidate this rule on Italy and leave it as something inheritable to his son Otto II. Also important to note, as we've sort of mentioned imperial succession, Otto II was made co-emperor with his father.
Yes, he does. When he's quite young, right?
Yeah, and the effect of this is to try and nullify any sort of impact that a imperial election would have. It's trying to establish a continuous line, again, a form of primogeniture, where the emperor would appoint his son as his co-emperor, who would eventually again succeed him. And this is done in France during the later West Francia and early France during Hugh Capet, which will eventually evolve into primogeniture.
I mean, it harks back to the days of Rome, doesn't it? Where Augustus would designate his heir. Yes.
You read my mind, Colombo. I was about to say the same thing.
Yes, exactly. Yep. And of course, this happens, many times during Rome, where there are various co-emperors, Marcus Aurelius appointing Commodus, etc. But
and also just worth mentioning too, this is actually also happening in the East Roman Empire at this time as well, with the case of Sebastocrator and the Basileus. It's still happening in Byzantium too.
Yeah. Do you mean Sebastocrator? Because I thought Sebastocrator was the most distinguished position that a non-member of the royal court could take, like a client king.
It honestly changed from sort of dynasty to dynasty. I mean, we know that these titles did vary, but I'm just throwing words out there. But yes, what I'm just alluding to is the fact that this did occur in the East Roman Empire contemporaneously in Francia and the Holy Roman Empire.
Exactly. But again, I think the point I'm trying to make is that it again is trying to move away from this system of elective succession and trying to establish a imperial mode of succession, which will continue. When we get to Otto II. You already mentioned the Fatimids in the Africa and the Emirate of Sicily. Otto II again spends most of his reign trying to consolidate Italy. So it's quite hard not to mention Italy. But needless to say, he tries to conquer Sicily from the Muslims and fails to do so. And the possessions such as Apulia and Calabria are ceded back to the Byzantine Emperor as well. I think in terms of the smooth succession, it's important to note that there were another branch of the Attonians in Bavaria, back from Otto's brother Henry, and this branch had been again excluded from the possibility of inheritance, while there was still a member of the more esteemed clan who could still inherit. So again, just securing the nature of the succession. But Otto, is very young and only rules for 10 years before he's replaced by Otto III, who again consolidates control over the Pope. He would install his cousin Gregory V as Pope, naming the first German Pope, and then Sylvester II. In terms of the overall sort of imperial ambition, he supported, missionary work into East Poland. And as we mentioned, this goes back to the creation of the Archdiocese of Magdeburg and its attempt to bring the East into some form of, again, Catholic relationship with the rest of the Catholic world by expanding it. This has already happened in Hungary, and this will, happen with the Duchy of Poland as well, even though Poland is now emerging as a potential rival and, will begin to attack the empire in the 11th century. When it comes to, the direct line of the Attonians, Otto III is the last direct descendant of Otto the Great by the male line. There is a rebellion in Rome because, again, most of the later Attonians are based in Rome, and they're constantly having to deal with conflicts of the local nobility and impose some sort of order there. And it's during one of these rebellions that Otto III suffers a fever and again dies quite young. And the direct line, as I said, dies out, and it relies on the Bavarian branch of the family to produce a new emperor. And this comes in the form of Henry II. Henry II, who is also a saint emperor. He's, I think, the only Holy Roman Emperor who is also a saint, even though...
does he not marry a daughter of the old family, or am I misremembering?
In terms of the connection, I'm not quite sure. I mean, his wife is Kunigrude, who is Kunigunde, who was also canonized. I'm not sure whether she was a member of the imperial dynasty, but I think the point is, though, he was still an Ottonian, even though it was from this Bavarian branch. He's also noteworthy for adopting the title of Rex Romanorum, which again is this title which implies an imminent sort of accession to the office of Holy Roman Empire, because it was very inconvenient, the fact that you get the acclamation as the emperor, the formal election by the nobility, and then the emperor has to make the formal process all the way to Rome in order to be crowned under favorable circumstances, depending on what civil war is going on in Rome at the time.
Yes, so, I believe didn't Napoleon give his son the title King of Rome as well?
Yes, he did. There were always all this Napoleonic allusions to this time period as well. So yes, the King of the Romans, again implying direct sort of anticipation of the imperial office, is created under Henry II to solve this uniquely sort of Holy Roman Empire problem. And during this period, we have like Bohemia joining the Holy Roman Empire. We have fights with Poland. I think what's more important, that all these reigns are consolidating the imperial rule and imperial preeminence over ecclesiastical affairs, as we mentioned. There isn't a very sort of ineffective emperor during this point. All of the emperors are sort of carrying on in the same vein. They're expanding the empire into Italy. They're trying to sort of expand into the east. They're trying to expand, the Christian influence, Christian empire. The Catholic Church as well is a direct sort of extension of imperial power at the same time. So you can say, really, during this time, during the Attonians and Henry II and later the Salians, that this represents like an apogee. This represents an early sort of golden age for the empire.
It is amazing though, because looking at how powerful they were, from a sort of territorial perspective, I suppose, and even in terms of resources, if you include the whole empire, it's amazing that they didn't exert themselves more, especially with regards to France. Because I mean, if my chronology is wrong, but weren't England and France having the 100 Years' War?
That's much later. But in terms of, England, the English-French connection begins in 1066. With the Normans. Yes. So it's quite a long time later. But in terms of like France, often
definitely
you don't see them strike out west at all. I'm just trying to.
They do strike out west, but it's not to expand the territory so much as it's to gain a favorable sort of candidate on the throne, who would act as some sort of, again, not client king especially, but someone who's preferable to the imperial sensibilities. Because I think we also mentioned that West Francia politically is very divided. West Francia is constantly having to fight, wars against Burgundy and wars against the Vikings, and again they have given them a fiefdom in the form of Normandy. That's where the creation of the Norman duchy comes from. They're also fighting in Aquitaine. They're also fighting in Catalonia. So I think what's interesting is that the Holy Roman Emperors are happy to retain their imperial possessions, the rest of the empire, with the exception of West Francia, so long as West Francia doesn't strike out against the Holy Roman Empire. But there's one exception to this, which is the Kingdom of Burgundy, which you can see on this map in the yellow. That was, again, had very sort of peaceful relations until we have the arrival of the first Salian king. I think what's also to mention is that, yes, we should emphasize that Henry II was a saint king. And I think this also advocates the point that whilst the papacy itself may have been at its lowest ebb, the Holy Roman emperors were invariably, very personally pious, even though they were exercising this autocratic control over the investment of bishops and, again, their alliance with ecclesiastical properties.
We might argue that their piety is the reason why, or is the justification that many of them gave for their power to appoint the bishops.
Yes,
right?
Precisely,
yes, they believe that they have every right to do this. Yeah.
Yes, every right as the defender of universal Christendom to have this control over the
heir to Constantine.
Yes, precisely. So again, you can really say that this period is Holy Roman and imperial. But yes, in terms of Burgundy, Conrad II is the first Salian emperor because, of course, Henry II, he's quite old when he dies. He's 59. Nevertheless, he and his saint wife were childless at the end, so the throne passes to another dynasty. In terms of like where the Salians come from, it's not like a complete end of the Ottonian dynasty, because the Salians were directly related to the Ottonians. I believe that Conrad II was the great-great-grandson of Otto the Great, and they had proved, very effective in terms of the imperial administration. Their personal base of power was in Franconia, and near the city of Worms, which is again in this basin around the Main River in Germany, in the center, where again the Archbishopric of Mainz is as well.
So
and,
is there a link here with the Salian Franks?
That's the sort of historical claim that I think in order to bolster the legitimacy of this dynasty, they did try and claim some sort of older
Frankish connection,
old sort of Frankish connection. But in terms of the actual sort of noteworthy sort of chronology, where we actually have members who are part of this dynasty, it actually goes back to 935. So it's not that distinguished, but nevertheless with Count Werner of Worms. But I think it's just important to note that they were a prominent noble family with very close connections to the Ottonians in the center of their power in Franconia. And they had this matrilineal descent from them, which made them quite obvious targets to take on in the extinction of the Ottonian line. In terms of stabilizing this new imperial dynasty of the Salians, one of the first things that Conrad II does is construct Speyer Cathedral. Speyer was the seat of Conrad's father, who was a count near Worms, and this would become like the imperial church. And it would later be expanded under his son Henry III to become one of the largest cities in Western Christendom, one of the largest churches in Western Christendom.
Is that not where they're buried?
Yes, exactly.
Yes,
and this is where you had the investment again of the properties. Even though the heart, as was so often the case, the heart will be separated from the body, and the heart will be buried in Goslar, and the bodies would be buried in Speyer Cathedral again, which is a testament to imperial and the grandeur of the Catholic Church as well.
I would also just on an architectural and artistic note, we're talking about this empire being truly Roman. The style of some of these cathedrals that are being built at this time, they're very fine, and they're all built out of stone, and they look remarkably like the late Roman fortifications, the Roman fortifications in cities like Cologne that exist, from the 3rd century. So much so that scholars in the 1700s who didn't have a firm grasp of the historical record, some of these buildings that had fallen into a poor condition that had been built at this time, they thought were actual Roman structures, which gives you an idea of just how I suppose strongly they were influenced by the Roman architecture that they saw around them, and how at the forefront of their mind that emulation was.
Yes, and that's a very important point to make, Lambert, this emulation of Rome. But also, Speyer Cathedral is probably one of the best examples of Romanesque architecture.
Yes, this is the beginning of the Romanesque, really. Yes. It's first flowering, yeah.
Absolutely huge. And as you mentioned, it's the imperial crypt as well as sort of the imperial church, and again built at the dynastic origin point of the Salian dynasty. And this is where the Conrad II will begin to adopt this air of sacred exaltation, this idea of ruling through virtue and probity, virtuis et probitas. And this is again just a continuation of the Atonian dynasty, of the proprietary church, investing the church with all this power to run the empire, although completely dependent on the person of the emperor who is at its head. And what I think we've already mentioned, little signs of upheaval. At the one point we have the fact that it led to a reforming zeal by the emperors themselves against the corruption of the city of Rome itself, but also Otto, in order to try and solidify his position in Italy, began to vest them the Italian states with a vast amount of autonomy, which is going to lead to problems down the line, as opposed to directly trying to impose his control in Rome. I mentioned Burgundy. Burgundy is inherited by Otto in 1032 when the Burgundian dynasty dies out, and this creates the royal triad, or the Regna Tria, which is Germany, Burgundy, and Italy, which basically forms the western borders of the Holy Roman Empire for really 300 years now. So
sorry, I can't quite remember if we touched on it before the show or during the show, but I feel like we should mention the story of Einhard and Evola's comments about when Otto the Great was crowned emperor. Because there's this debate that comes later, with the Guelphs and the Ghibellines about who should have the primacy, which we're getting into now. And Evola talks about this, and he notes, coming from this perspective of admiration for the sort of the strong imperial model, that the emperor didn't have that power there, or the papacy didn't have that power, and that the Pope actually prostrated himself before the emperor in this period. And there's this idea of kingship kingship being inherent within the individual, and the church not granting it, but sort of allowing it to achieve its full power. The church is just a sort of conduit for the imperial power that's already there, right? And so it seems, it's Einhard in his Life of Charlemagne who records this, that the Pope prostrated himself and sort of worshipped the emperor when he crowned him emperor. And so he sort of, Evola is trying to argue against this idea of the church being dominant in favor of this imperial vision.
Yes, I think probably the one exception is that even when we have the Atonian diploma, which announces again the roles as secular protector, but not as controller over dogma, so to speak. That's still like an ongoing question. But in terms of like the supreme defender of the church, absolutely. Even though again the question over who controls dogma, as it had in the Eastern Roman Empire, is very contentious, because we had a stream about Heraclius discussing how all of his attempts to compromise with the episcopacy, ultimately failed when he tried to bridge the relationship between the traditional Orthodox and the Monophysites. But the last sort of emperor I want to discuss before we get on to the investor controversy is Henry III, because Henry III, you could say again, represents the apogee of this period. You have a smooth succession. He enlarges Speyer Cathedral, and he goes to Rome, and he ends various papal schisms, who defeats rebellions. He consolidates his rule. However, there is one sort of underlying factor, is that when he dies in 1056, he has left a reform party in control in the papacy. We'll get and talk to the history of the papacy in a moment. The party favoring the liberty of the church, or Libertas Ecclesiae. And on the one hand, yes, he has removed a series of corrupt bishops and, exercised again complete imperial control by routinely nominating bishops. Yet at the same time, he has granted power to these reformers, who are going to not only sort of want to reform the church within itself, but advocate for papal supremacy, which is when we get to the investor controversy. And before we sort of just enter into the discussion, Marcus, is there anything you want to say on the Attonians and the Salians before we get on to the investiture controversy?
Not really. The one thing I will actually contribute though, because I don't know if it's been mentioned, that the Salians via Otto of Worms actually is a descendant of both the Conradines, that is the dynasty of Conrad I, via Conrad the Red, and obviously others themselves descendants of the Ottonians. So in essence, they're sort of they unify the predecessors of the Ottonians and of the Ottonians themselves, which is worth mentioning.
Yes, I think that's how exalted the Salians were, and again how they continued this tradition. But here we get to the you can see the end of this apogee, the end of this autocratic rulership, and it ends actually very quickly, considering how we've had nearly 100 years of stable sort of autocratic imperial rule. And I have a little segment here by Evola, which talks about the universalism represented by the church and the regal ideal embodied, though without some compromises, in the Holy Roman Emperor. And this is, the segment as it follows. according to the regal ideal, the emperor is really the caput ecclesiae, not in the sense that he takes the place of the head of the priestly hierarchy, the Pope, but in the sense that only in the imperial function may the force that is represented by the church and that animates Christianity efficaciously impose its dominion in this context. The world portrayed as a vast unitary whole, represented by the church, was perceived as a body in which the single members are coordinated under the supreme direction of the emperor, who is at the same time the leader of the realm and of the church. The emperor, although he was constituted as such by the right of investiture that followed the other investitures relative to the secular aspect of the Teutonic prince, claimed to have received his right and his power directly from God, and claimed to acknowledge only God above himself. Therefore, the role of the head of the priestly hierarchy, who had consecrated him, could logically be only that of a mere mediator, unable, accordingly to the Ghibelline ideal, to revoke by means of excommunication the supernatural force with which the emperor has been endowed. Before the Gregorian interpretation subverted the very essence of the ancient symbols, the old tradition was upheld in lieu of the fact that the empire had always and everywhere been compared to as the sun, as the church had been compared to the moon. So yeah, I think that's quite a good sort of overview of what the sort of imperial sort of doctrine was before we get onto the Pope. And as we mentioned, the papacy has sort of been going for a very dark time. So from 900 onwards, up until the arrival of Otto, we have this period known as the pornocracy, or the Secalum Obscurum, which is obviously translated as the Dark Ages, with the popes dependent on a faction known as the Theophylacti, the Council of Tusculum. Theophylact was I actually know sort of very little about him, so unless you want to sort of comment anything interesting, I'm more interested in Marozia and Theodora.
I mean, I think of course they had their roots in the conquest of Justinian, and they sort of built up their power base through the Byzantine domination, which I mean is obvious by their Greek names and Greek titles and so forth.
So but what's interesting is that this family was able to, exert a very profound influence over these various popes. So say, for example, the daughter of Theophylact, Marozia, had been the concubine of Pope Sergius III and the mother of John the 11th, and had also apparently been responsible for a plot to murder John the 10th as well. And this is attested by Liutprand of Cremona, who had, been one of the principal sources we look at in the 10th century. So I find it amazing that, again, this one family had, exerted so much influence and, really for the worse, where so much horrific intrigue was going on with the papal
I mean,
system.
unfortunately, it's not the sole example. I mean, the Borgias and such like later.
Yes, I think the difference, though, between the Borgias and the popes of this period is that the Borgias were still, we're talking about the beginning of the Renaissance papacy, the end of the Western Schism. They were actually, in terms of their temporal power, in a better position, especially in terms of Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander VI, was able actually to organize a coalition that defeated Charles VIII. But when it comes to popes such as Sergius III or John the 11th and John the 10th, they basically have very little influence even beyond the confines of the city of Rome itself. I mean, on the one hand, we have the donations of Pepin, we have the Papal States, which nominally should have guaranteed the temporal authority of the popes. Yet on the one hand, the popes themselves are actually dominated by the local aristocracy within the Papal States itself, and the Papal States are invariably, as we mentioned with Otto, actually occupied by the emperor himself. So,
and of course, there is still this debate around the status of the Pope himself. Whereas once we get into the High Renaissance in the 1500s, the Pope's supreme position is pretty much confirmed, and it's sort of unthinkable to rebel against the Pope in that way until the Reformation.
Yes, just to give a bit of context. Obviously, the Pope had been, deferential to the Byzantine emperors, really up until the middle of the 8th century. And what we see in the 8th century is not this, again, massive sort of advocacy of papal supremacy. However, we just see the transfer of allegiance passed from the emperor in the east to Charlemagne. We don't see any sort of, again, reassertion of papal supremacy. If anything, it's just the temporal power of the popes, which, again, the popes are wanting some sort of independence from the whims of a tyrannical secular ruler. However, the irony, of course, being that their own secular nobility are, controlling them without the need of an emperor to control them directly, which results in, all of these constant sort of civil wars within the papacy, and again, not being able to exercise, really any influence beyond the confines of the city itself. So, beyond the Council of Tusculum under the Theophylacti, we also have the Crescentii family, which also dominates the papacy during this period. But the Council of Tusculum make a brief revival. So this is going on at the same time that the Ottonians and the Salians are, affecting this complete supremacy. So the Council of Tusculum begin to control, other popes such as, Benedict VIII, John the 19th, and of course Benedict the IX, who was the one, deposed by Henry III, repeatedly in this civil war. And this really only ends with the arrival of sort of the Pope reformer Clement II, and then eventually Nicholas II. As I mentioned, the irony being of the investiture controversy is that Clement II is put on the, is basically made Pope by the emperors. And then the reform-minded popes begin to advocate these reforms to ensure the independence of the appointments of the popes so that this thing will never happen again. So under Nicholas II, we have the institution of the College of Cardinals in 1059, which, gives them a formalized system of appointments beyond all the system of political patronage, even though, as we see, that's still open to bribery and corruption, but to a lesser extent. And we have the ascendancy of one Hildebrand of Savona, later Gregory VII, who is, as Evelyn names, is the eponymous sort of reason for the Gregorian reforms, which is, one of the most radical calls for reformation within the Catholic Church itself at the expense of the empire. So in 1075, Gregory is made Pope in 1073 as Gregory VII. I think it's useful to read out some of the dictats of the Dictatus Papae, because as we mentioned, there wasn't...
Yes, there were some points of real controversy in there, right?
As we mentioned, the popes had basically been, controlled within Rome itself, and the emperor had appointed, popes on a whim. Well, just listen to this and, hear the complete affirmation of papal supremacy at the expense of, but you can say, completely ahistorical compared to everything that's been going on in terms of the increasingly detrimental position of the popes. The Roman Church was founded solely by God. Only the Pope with right can be called universal. And again, taking away the idea of the emperor as universal. I mean, the idea of the emperor as universal was so ingrained that it led to constant conflicts with the Eastern Roman emperors and the Holy Roman emperors.
But yeah, because... I mean, the idea of universality is still bound up in the minds of everyone with the Roman Empire, right? And then the imperial side of it,
Yes, so this is an incredibly bold claim to make, and one that was, completely at odds with the situation of the day. He alone can depose or reinstate bishops, and this is again a controversial one. He alone may use the imperial insignia, and this is the Pope claiming again the direct sort of descent from, you can say, the donations of Constantine, which later proven to be forged, where the idea that Rome has been invested with this imperial power and with the Pope himself, the successor of Peter, as preeminent over all of the other episcopacies. But now it's not just that, it's over all other secular authorities as well. And again, this idea of the imperial insignia being referred to as universal, and him almost as the successor of the Roman emperors, and not of that of the Holy Roman Emperor, which again is quite astounding. All princes shall kiss the feet of the Pope alone. His name alone shall be spoken in the churches. And again, it had been very common at this point, even still today in some Anglican churches, where the king is mentioned, the king is mentioned during church services. His title is unique in the world. It may be permitted to depose emperors. And again, that's a very controversial point. The idea that the Pope now doesn't just recognize the power of the emperor, but now has the right to appoint and remove at whim. It may be permitted to transfer bishops if need be. He has the power to ordain the clerk of any parish he wishes. No synod shall be called a general synod without his order. And again, another important factor of late church history is that many synods were held by many authorities, whether it be the Eastern Roman bishop, Eastern Roman emperor, the Patriarch of Constantinople, or the emperor himself, or the Holy Roman Emperor himself. So this idea again that only the the Pope can actually usher in a general synod is, quite revolutionary.
And this this seems to have continued, this idea of the emperor in some sense being an authority during matters of dogma and such controversy, because and of course it might be different, perhaps you can explain, but when we have, say, Martin Luther at Worms, doesn't the emperor preside over this this hearing?
Yes, and this is talking about the establishment of the Concordat of Worms in 1122. So is it the Concordat of Worms? Am I right? Yes, it is Concordat of Worms. Where the emperor doesn't officiate, i.e., he isn't supreme, but he is arbiter and he is judge. So he is simply there to ensure the correct proceedings, as opposed to direct proceedings, which is
I see. Okay, yeah. So he's not deciding matters of dogma. Yeah, he's sort of the authority.
Yeah, yes, he's basically the outside secular observer to make sure the rules are observed. No chapter and no book shall be considered canonical without his authority. A sentence passed by him may be retracted by no one. He alone may retract it. He himself may be judged by no one. And again, this is emphasizing the supremacy of the Pope above the emperor. The most important cases of every church should be referred to the Apostolic See. And this is where we see this is not just a movement directed at the emperor. This is a movement directed at the bishops of, all across the empire and European Christendom as well. It's not just an attempt to take away, imperial supremacy, but it is an attempt to exert papal supremacy over the entire Catholic Church. And indeed, the whole church in general, because we had the schism in 1054. He may absolve subjects from their fealty to wicked men. And of course, that is a crucial factor in the sense that any king who is seen to be, rebellious or wicked, or
his lords do not have to obey him.
His lords do not need to pay homage to him anymore. So this gives the Pope, wide-ranging powers to completely undermine and destroy the nature of imperial supremacy. I mean, it's the repudiation of any sort of ecclesiastical authority of the emperor. And it also makes the Roman Curia the supreme and universal legislative assembly, across the world. It centralizes power back in the city of Rome, as opposed to, again, any sort of imperial conclave or assembly. And so we have, I think, in terms of why this is happening, of course, we've mentioned, what a horrific state the papacy had been in during the 10th and the 11th centuries. We mentioned the fact that there had been the Great Schism in 1054. On the one hand, it was so the Pope could usher in the Gregorian reforms, which were principally targeted at simony and ensuring clerical celibacy. Gregory VII didn't invent clerical celibacy. I mean, the whole point about being a Catholic is that Catholic doctrine isn't supposed to be novel. It's simply a assertion of an already sort of permanently established position.
Just a little FYI for anyone who doesn't know, simony is basically selling offices, right?
Yes, exactly. And Gregory is going to very much stretch the definition of simony in the investiture controversy. Yes. So we have, advocating against clerical marriage and ensuring, compulsory celibacy. And again, the Pope is against clerical celibacy, against clerical marriage for, the same reason that the emperor did not want to appoint nobles to his ranks, in the sense that bishoprics will become hereditary, i.e. they could just be inherited by, very noble, powerful families who begin to monopolize these various sort of bishoprics. So this again
essentially controlling hereditary titles within the clergy, more or less.
Yes, exactly. So this is all in addition to reforming the actual sort of moral integrity of the church, because of course clerical celibacy is about avowing one's complete loyalty and service unto God. It is also a affirmation of papal power at the same time, that as Otto wanted to make himself sole appointee of all sort of imperial offices, now it is the Pope who's wanting to make himself sole appointee of all clerical offices and make the again the office of Pope superior to that of the position of Otto. In terms of again, we sort of mentioned the justification for this, which is the Pope, the papacy being at an incredibly low ebb, but it was made possible by the fact that Henry III had died prematurely, and his son, Henry IV, was only 6 years old when he ascended, which led to a long period of minority rule. in which there was a weak regency, which allowed the nobles and the church to gain more independence at a time where the reformers have been placed in power in the church and were now advocating for papal supremacy again. So all of these things happened to Henry IV at the worst possible time really imaginable. So when he finally achieves his royal majority in 1073, he simply tries to assume the prerogatives over appointments and his control over the nobles at the same time, and to show how effective this again the Gregorian reforms against simony have been, because again these were going on before he'd been made pope, when he was effectively the advisor to Alexander II and to Nicholas II. The idea of the prerogative appointments rested in the emperor is now considered simony. It's now considered that the emperor is using this position to effectively corrupt the nature of the offices by basically selling them off to political appointees. And so Alexander II excommunicates Henry's advisors. He hasn't yet put the blame on the emperor himself, again showing the empowered position of the papacy. At the same time, we have various Saxon risings, because of course the nobility are pissed off that the emperor is trying to advocate for this autocratic position. So in response, again dealing with the Pope, in 1076, as a response to Dictus Papae, the German bishops declared the Pope's election invalid, because, as we mentioned, it's not just an attempt to negate the power of the emperor, but it's also an attempt to solidify the control of the Pope. So many bishops naturally wanted to prevent the Pope becoming too powerful at their own expense, and so would more than willingly ally with the emperor if they thought it was a lesser evil than submitting entirely to the Pope. In response to this, Henry is excommunicated. So Gregory VII actually excommunicates the Holy Roman Emperor. And this leads, as you mentioned, right at the beginning of this discussion, Columba, to the walk at Canossa, the humiliation of Canossa, where the emperor travels to Italy in 1077 and makes this long sort of prostration, asking essentially for the forgiveness and absolution of Pope Gregory. And Gregory, again, something very similar happens to this with was it Louis the Pious earlier in history and later in history, with Henry II over the death of Thomas the Becket, where the emperor or the Christian ruler makes this great display of contrition and Christian piety. And in
yes, I believe Henry had to strip himself of all his fine clothes and wear a sort of rough spun garb, and he had to wait prostrate outside. Well, some sources say that he had to wait prostrate outside the walls and biting cold for 3 days in penance. But it's this public display of penance, which, as you say, Henry II did as well. I mean, he was also a no fan of the Saxons, but that's another thing.
So yes, this of course has to earn Gregory's absolution, because Gregory is really in no position to oppose this. The emperor has done the needed prostration before him and receives the Pope's absolution. However, this doesn't end here. This is a threat that Henry IV is going to have to deal with his entire life. His authority weakened in Germany by this. We have the election of the first anti-king to the Holy Roman Emperor, Rudolf of Rheinfelden.
Do you think the nobles were sort of a bit disgusted by this display, or
no? I think it's more just a sign of. I'm sure it's a sign of weakness.
Opportunism, yes.
More opportunism. I mean, as we mentioned, it's not just the fact that the popes are becoming more bold, is the fact that the nobles are chafing under this autocratic administration, and they're wanting to turn it on its head and exercise more power. By
the emperor, it's interesting, because the emperor, when he's still dux, say, or the king when he's still dux, when he's still military leader, he builds up this power through the aristocratic military base. But then once he becomes sort of rex, once he becomes the sort of the ruler of the state, once he then tries to consolidate that, he alienates the nobility. And so the emperor at this point has no base at all. He's alienated the church and his nobles.
So I think it's important to note that the alienation of the church, again, it's more complicated simply due to the fact that
the German church is with him.
The German churches periodically, changes sides, and the sort of break with the church is more going to happen under Henry V than it's going to happen under Henry IV. But nevertheless, Henry is excommunicated again once he tries to assume control over investments, because again, it's very important. The whole nature of Ottonian and Salian imperial rule relies on clerical appointments, and if you can't appoint, your various administrators to these
no
positions,
bureaucracy, no
there's no
empire.
bureaucracy. Your entire bureaucracy is controlled by a foreign power, just to put in purely secular terms. And as a result, the emperor is completely dispossessed. So Henry can't follow the extreme provisions on simony issued by the Gregorian reforms and accept this supremacy of papal power. So he reverts and tries to fight the Pope, and this leads to another excommunication in 1080. And in response to this, rather than allowing this, Henry simply elevates an anti-pope, Clement III. But in terms of, and it's Clement III who finally crowns Henry as Holy Roman Emperor, not Gregory VII. But this continues. I mean, the true Pope Urban II, who succeeds onwards from Gregory VII, begins to undermine the universality of the imperial position even more by ordering the First Crusade. This again idea of a massive military effort, conducted by a theocratic official. You can say it's another sort of revolution in terms of undermining the central role of the emperor, because as we see under Charlemagne, Charlemagne.
Yes, this is the domain of the emperor. Yes.
Yes. So it's impeding on the secular authority of the emperor, not just the ecclesiastical authority of the emperor as well. And all of
I
these
can
things...
really understand how looking at this sort of history, your own particular sympathies about perhaps the changes in the church that are needed, or the ideal form of administration for the church. I'm increasingly sympathetic to your views.
Oh, okay. Well, again, I just I think sort of a lot of historians have sort of made a lot about the fact that it's good in the way that neither the Pope nor the Emperor was able to achieve, supreme authority, because obviously they're anti-Catholic and they believe that any one authority would have led to, horrific tyranny. Nevertheless, I think this just leads to you can say, the disintegration of the universality of Christendom, and you can say in a weakened position when we get to the Protestant Reformation. But yes, I think it's very important to explain that when we look at the early Roman Empire, I mean, there's nothing sadistic about it. If anything, ironically, it was the Holy Roman Emperors who were responsible for the reform movement in the church,
yes,
rather than the popes. So the irony is that the reform movement also goes along with these increased calls for papal supremacy. So I think it's fair to say that Henry IV was completely within his rights to act the way he did.
Oh, so I mean, reading about Henry IV, I must say, did come across as quite a sympathetic figure. Yes, there's a man born into a difficult situation.
Absolutely, and again, it's not his fault that he inherits at the age of 6, and throughout the next sort of 10 years, the nobles and the churchmen are advocating all authority at the expense of his father's autocracy and the autocracy of the Atonian and Salian dynasties in general. So yes, he doesn't give up. Sorry, Marcus.
I was just going to say, in some degree too, this sort of presents itself as something of a bit of a portent and a precursor to the struggle that would often occur in, particularly in these Western European societies. We see it quite extensively in England a little after the Norman invasion, quite especially. But this sort of struggle between, this sort of earthly authority of a sovereign or of the aristocracy, in particular the king, and that of the ecclesiastical side of things, and this sort of struggle between crown land and authority, and a very profound struggle of power between these two entities that are the most predominant in a feudal medieval society.
Definitely, and it ends in a lot of places with the nobles simply stealing everything.
Right. It'd be the equivalent of how Stalin quipped about how many divisions does the Pope have. How many knights does the Pope have in the the 11th century.
So yes, just to quickly sum up, because we're running out of time, just want to quickly conclude this. Henry IV, again, makes many attempts to try and undermine the rule of Urban II. So much as allying with allying against Matilda of Tuscany, who was one of the most prominent rulers in Italy at this point and the protector of the Pope. Nevertheless, this is where the comment I made in the Dictus Papae, he may absolve subjects from their fealty to wicked men, really comes into fore, because now the Pope is contributing to the active undermining of the inviolability of the empire by calling on civil war within the empire to try and depose Henry IV. So first it's his own co-king, Conrad II, his own son, who was brought on with the Welf dynasty of Bavaria. And just a little side note, Welf of Bavaria, who is the Duke of Bavaria at this point, is a founder of one of the most, again, prominent German dynasties, which will be a constant thorn in the side of not only the Salian dynasty, but also the Hohenstaufen dynasty, and would provide, I believe, the basis for the House of Wettin and the House of Hanover. And you will exercise, very significant influence over Germany for, hundreds of years to come. But, the House of Welf against the House of the House of Salian, begins here. And after Clement III dies, Henry IV doesn't appoint another anti-pope and tries to make peace with Pascal II, but fails to do so. So in the end, Henry is actually deposed by a revolt by his son, Henry V. So the emperor is betrayed on all sides. He is there is rebellion sort of incited with an alliance of the Pope's allies against him, and he's ultimately removed. But when Henry V removes him and achieves this coup, it is a double-sided sword, because Henry V had allied with the nobles who had opposed imperial autocracy to achieve it. Now Henry V was now in this position of consensual rule, where he had to simply act as the first among princes, and this position was there for the first 6 years. And
so he's basically back to square one, the position of Otto
exactly.
I. Yes.
Or even before that, back to Henry the Fowler. So yes, all of the reforms towards imperial autocracy have been undone, and Henry V tries and fails to reconsolidate his position. And the issue is that his attempt to consolidate his power relies on, again, the Archbishop of Mainz. As I mentioned, in many senses, the Archbishop of Mainz, who traditionally held the office of imperial chancellor, was in sometimes more powerful than the Pope due to his preeminence over the Church of Germany, which was one of the richest and most powerful churches in the world at that time. And yet Henry V decides to dispute the territory in Franconia of Adalbert of Saarbrücken, the then Archbishop of Mainz, and then imprisons him, completely sort of resulting in the breakaway of this ancient alliance between the Ottonian, the Salians, and the Archbishop of Mainz. And so the rest of his reign is an attempt to, secure peace and trying to restore Salian autocracy in Germany, but he's constantly defeated, and he's alienated all the remaining factions. So now the bishops in Germany are now against Henry V as well. It's not just the nobles. It's not
talk about burning bridges. Huh?
Yes. So in 1121, it's the princes who compel Henry to surrender to the papacy, and this leads to the Concordat of Worms in 1122, which ends the investment controversy with Pope Calixtus II. And this is where what I mentioned earlier with Columba, the fact that the emperor's presence as arbiter within the empire over lay disputes and lay investiture would be established, but the actual idea of lay investiture is eliminated. So the emperor is, seriously diminished in his rank. The Pope is now, principally responsible for investing bishops, throughout Europe at this point.
Yes, and in the view of someone like Evola, I suppose the feminine principle has triumphed over the masculine. If you want to get down to that sort of fundamental and quite airy way of putting things,
Yes, and I think what also the Concordat of Worms establishes is it destroys the emperor's claim to any universality over Christendom, because he is only able to stand in as arbiter within disputes within the empire. He's not able to get involved in clerical disputes in other kingdoms and other realms anymore.
He basically becomes the church's attack dog,
Well, probably even less than that. I mean, it really is. He's become, diminished to just one of many Christian kings, of which there are many. Unlike in the time of Charlemagne, Charlemagne, who you could say is almost the sole major Christian king in the West, with the exception of a couple of Anglo-Saxon kings. Now Henry V is ruling as one of many rulers, competing with the King of France, competing with the King of England, competing with the dukes, then kings of Poland, competing with the kings of Hungary, competing with the kings of Leon in northern Spain, which will then become the Kingdom of Castile, and later become the Kingdom of Spain. So yes, you can say this is an attempt to severely undermine, but it's not definitive. I think what's important to note. I mean,
and on that point, if I just may quickly, this is actually one of the objective differences between sort of Catholicism in the West with the Western kings of the kings of the Western kingdoms, and say the relationship between the Patriarch and the Emperor of the East, because Byzantium is without doubt the preeminent Orthodox power in its sphere at this point in time, and the relationship is rather more symbiotic. In the case of the West, like you just said, you have the Pope and papal authority, and all of these kings of comparable power who can't actually either enforce the Pope's wishes nor contest the Pope without there being considerable friction between the various realms at any given time.
Yes,
maybe a part of that is the continuing legacy of Romanitas in the East, and the idea that the Byzantine emperors have a sort of a stronger claim to that universality, and it's harder for it to slip away than it is for, say, the Holy Roman emperors.
I was more like thinking of the relationship of the Patriarch and the Emperor as a symbiotic relationship specifically, as opposed to like the Pope and the various kings and this sort of inevitable friction that would occur between them based upon controversies such as the investiture, for instance, or even in the case of contest between the papal elections and the College of Cardinals and what have you.
Yes, I think I would actually say it is a competing versions of Romanitas, because the Pope is advocating for supremacy based on his control over the Roman Catholic Church, and the Emperor is wanting supremacy over the Pope. I mean, this would just continue. I mean, Boniface VIII would declare, himself, both supreme master of the temporal and the spiritual realms. And this issue will continue, intensified during the Guelph and Ghibelline conflicts in the 13th and the 14th centuries, especially under Frederick II and Hohenstaufen. But that is a lead into next week's discussion, which will discuss what happens next under the House of Hohenstaufen. In terms of like Henry V, he dies in 1125, and the Salian dynasty dies with him. So I think that's quite a good way to end this discussion. I think, the main points obviously being that the empire is established as a truly holy Roman Empire. It achieves, a central position as, the preeminent sort of preeminent power among all sort of Christian kings. It establishes a form
spiritually as well as temporally.
Yes, it establishes a form of, almost autocracy as much as you can be in the time frame of this period, and it establishes complete dominance over the church. However, as you can see, it was the reliance on the church which actually sows the seeds for the division, with the assumption of the popes of the papal supremacy under the Gregorian reforms and Gregory VII, and then the issuing of the Crusades and Urban II. So if without further ado, unless anyone has any further points to make, I'll go on to super chats and we'll wrap things up, if that's all right.
Fine by me.
Great. So
I'm good.
Great. So just a little notification for patrons again, if anyone wants to go on to Subscribestar. The English Loyalist for $9.99 says, "Thanks for this great stream. I wish we had more people to be more involved in history. You have a great gift and vast knowledge of it. Thank you for sharing it. Voltaire's quote on the HRE is hilarious." Well, thank you very much, English Loyalist. That means so much. In terms of Voltaire's quote, obviously, Voltaire referred to the Holy Roman Empire as a nightmare. And again, obviously, the reforming Enlightenment, Holy Roman of Voltaire, the idea of all these ancient principalities with all their overlapping sort of ancient like historical roots were, abhorrent to the Enlightened sort of centrally administered.
Well, I mean, look where your ideas got you, Voltaire. Look what happened. He's so smug, honestly. It's the most frustrating.
He definitely is. There is a point I want to make. Actually, it does pertain to the super chat. If I may elaborate very briefly,
Sure.
That. I've talked about it, I think, in 2 streams prior, and I do mention that interview that Edward Luttwak gives pertain to his book about the grand strategy of the Byzantine Empire, and he makes a reference to why Byzantology is such a difficult field, and it sort of pertains to that quote by Voltaire, and that is the Enlightenment, and due to reasons that I think probably AM is far more qualified than me to speculate on, but the intellectuals that were either participants of the genesis of the Enlightenment or were born subsequent of the culture of the Enlightenment, of the French Revolution, have a very, very profound sort of anti-religious bent about them. And in the context of the Byzantines, they detested the religiosity of the Greeks, of the East Romans, the Orthodox, and they also made no bones about, you might say, making a chasm between this temporal Roman legacy and its link to sort of papal spirituality. And at no given time do they ever spare not trying to sort of forcefully tear those influences apart. And so rather than discussing things such as, fusion and symbiosis and the interrelationships between these things, and it isn't all lovey-dovey, not all that is bright and happy. Rarely things are in history.
No, you're totally right, Marcus. Yeah.
But the Enlightenment thinkers make a point of absolutely tearing these things apart, and they can't exist in isolation, and they weren't always hostile.
The reason why they do this, at least in my opinion, the reason why Gibbon, accuses Christianity of destroying the empire is because all of these Enlightenment men, all of these Renaissance men, they all have a massive, I guess, hard on, if you'll forgive my French, for Romanitas, right? And Roman history and Greek history, and they want it, but they also want to do whatever the hell they want, and they want to give free rein to their passions, and so they can't accept the church, which they're battling against and trying to subvert, is the descendant of these, at least ideologically, and spiritually, of these very forces that they claim to love. So I would say that's the reason. It's a rank piece of hypocrisy and stupidity. This is why I've called Gibbon satanic on here before.
They're intellectual trucks. Let's just leave it at that.
Trucks, yes.
Yes, I think, if nothing else, I think we've actually quite elucidated how, of course, we associate symphonia with the Eastern tradition, this idea of, the good working relationship between the church and the patriarch and the bishops and the Eastern Roman Emperor. But I think we've more or less demonstrated that it did exist in the West, and perhaps could have existed had the Ghibelline faction been in a better position. I'm very happy to hear that Columba, I've won you over to the Ghibelline side. But
well, I mean, they're still not ethnically Roman, and that's my question. We were talking about the nation of the Romans. That was our first stream. But I mean, I certainly agree with you ideologically, and I am becoming much more sympathetic to your views on the church. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you everyone for watching. Thank you for that one super chat. Columba, anything else you want to show?
I was talking to the one and only the Raw Egg Nationalist today, if anyone's heard of him. and I'm thinking I'm going to contribute an article to Man's World, his magazine with the Bronze Age pervert crowd. Going to try and convert some of them. So I'm going to write an article about the masculine qualities of the church and demonstrate how, because these guys all have this idea of the church as being this prissy, feminine, sort of weak institution. The Gibbonian position that we've just been discussing. So
the effete position.
Yes, and so I'm going to thoroughly smash that. Talk about Charlemagne. Talk about maybe Julius II, and also. There was a priest, because they've been writing a lot about conquistadors in their magazine. There was a priest who lived in the 1600s, and he sort of became a sort of tribal peacemaker amongst the Pueblo Indians. His name has escaped me. It's really frustrating. But I'm going to be writing that, and hopefully it'll be good enough, and that'll probably be out in like a month, say. So look out for that.
Wonderful. Marcus?
Very good, Columba. That actually sounds really intriguing. No, I have nothing. Just thank you for everyone, and also for you guys too. This is actually one period which is something of a chasm in my knowledge. So I
Well,
hope
it was for me too.
tonight,
It's been a bit whirlwind. Yeah.
I hope tonight I was adequate, and yeah, looking forward to keeping on with the series. And yeah, cheers, AM, and we'll see you all next week, I suppose.
Yeah, sure. Just for updates on channel stuff. On Wednesday, hopefully, I'm going to be having Nathan Hood to discuss the historical inspirations and religious inspirations behind the characters in the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits. So
Should be good.
for anyone who's interested in something just beyond pure history, that there's that. One more super chat has come in from King Cribble for £5. When you guys get to the 17th century Germany, will you talk about the Sabbatean Frankists? I think from what you said, AA stream, that Rasputin was one of them. I don't actually know anything about the Sabbatean Frankists unless
I know a little bit about the the Frankists, but let's just say you have to be careful what you can say about the Frankists on YouTube.
Well, thank you very much for that warning.
Yes.
So thank you for that super chat, King Cribble. Thank you everyone for watching. Thank you to my wonderful guests, and good night.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.